Welcome back to Talking Europe. Diplomacy today has no power and the world is heading towards war. That's a very concise conclusion of our guest this week. He's the man who brought us freedom fries when he outraged the US by standing up at the UN Security Council in 2003 and on behalf of France refused to support the war in Iraq. That was, of course, under the Bush administration. Since then, our guest, former French Foreign Minister and indeed former Prime Minister Dominique de Villepin, has kept a close eye on American presidents and indeed global politics. Your new book, A Manifesto for Peace in a Time of War, isn't the most uplifting of reads. Now, Mr. de Villepin, you also, as well as serving as a minister for France, you also served as ambassador to the US in the early 80s. And at that time, or the mid-80s rather, at that time, you knew Donald Trump, the businessman, the man who is now president of the United States. What do you make of, one, the policies he's pushed through since in his first few weeks in office? And is this a man we can trust? He seems to act a lot on impulse.
Yeah, I think instinct, emotion is taking the lead in international politics, and that's not something really reassuring. We can be afraid of that trend. So much more than before, we should be very careful about preparing our decisions and being united. I think facing imprevisibility of the US, it's important to be united as Europeans and also to take the lead, to take initiative. If we want to avoid the very uncertain perspective that we are entering in. We have the question of Russia, we have the Chinese question, we have the question of the US, we have so many crises in the Middle East. Europe has to take a full responsibility for leading the international community. And I'm afraid we are so divided, so fearful about the future, so fearful about globalization, that we are not doing that. And that might be our weakness.
Do you think maybe in a certain way, following Brexit and now, Donald Trump as president of the US, that perhaps it's a lucky thing for the rest of the EU? Maybe it might be the thing to bring them together, because indeed, in terms of trade, security and even the environment, there is talk of that.
Yes, there is both a challenge and an opportunity. Having a strong initiative on defense because of the new position of Donald Trump on NATO, to have a new strategy on important projects, energy, refugees, try to show to our people in Europe that Europe is useful. There is a strong doubt everywhere, in every country, UK, France, Germany, but also in the Eastern Europe, about what can achieve Europe. And I think that it is important to show very pragmatically that we can solve many problems and that we are better together than alone.
And do you still believe the EU can? Because you mentioned there the refugee crisis, and attention really has turned recently from the Eastern Mediterranean problem to the Central Mediterranean problem. 90% of the people arriving into the EU in 2016 came from Libya. We saw a Malta summit there on Friday. The solution for the EU seems to be to speak to a country that has two governments, is really not a stable place.
Yes, I think that's a problem. We had an agreement, and Germany took the lead with Turkey to have an agreement on the eastern part of Mediterranean. Now we are trying to have a deal with Libya on the central Mediterranean. But that's not that easy. As you said, Libya is very much a failed state. Marshal Haftar is the strong man. The prime minister is quite weak, supported by the United Nations and by many countries, but he doesn't have the capacity to take decisions and to have them apply. So I believe we have to do first our homework. And concerning the question of the refugees, we need to have a much stronger policy at our borders, strong coast guards, strong policy concerning the right of asylum. We should be on the verge of initiative, able to take steps together, and we are not doing that. So we are trying to rely on our neighbors. We are trying to rely on other countries to take the responsibility for us. But, that's crazy. I don't think that is a way we can really solve the refugee crisis.
Because, it does seem like our solution is keep people out and keep people in other countries. Now, from the African continent, a lot of them are more economic migrants, but you mentioned there refugees, the most people coming from the other side were coming from Syria, fleeing war. Now, France has taken part in the military operation in Syria. I believe you feel this is a mistake. This is not the solution on the Syrian
Yes,
crisis.
I believe one of the mistakes of our diplomacies and European diplomacy, and of course mainly French diplomacy, has been to rely on the military tool as a way to solve all the crises. I don't believe you can solve a crisis just by sending troops, using the military. That's not enough. We need a strong vision, a strong policy, and we need diplomacy. And there is a strong lack of vision and of diplomacy on the side of Europe. Europe has to have a vision of what could be a more stable Middle East, what could be a more stable Syria. First thing,
and there's not one politician in Europe that might be able to push for that vision?
Well, there is not one single politician that has the right principles. We should first be able to speak with everybody. Our policy on sanctions has not made of Europe a good interlocutor for Russia. We have decided that Bashar al-Assad was the wrong man. And of course, he's not the solution for Syria on the long run, but he's there. So we should really take Syria as it is. And we
forgot
even
carrying out autocracies in their own country.
Yes, but we forgot the main thing. We forgot that the first responsibility for Europe was trying to solve the problem for the people of Syria. We had more than 300,000 people that died in Syria. Our first responsibility was to have and try to have a ceasefire, a political settlement, a political dialogue, and we have not fought for that. So I believe that we have done things wrong. We have now a new situation. The US is going to be back in the game. We should try to avoid US and Russia alone trying to find a solution. I think that Europe is very much needed to be part of the solution and to help in the process, because concerning the refugee crisis, concerning the recovery of the region, we will need a big master plan for the development of the economy of Syria and of the region. We need Europe.
Find a voice. Well, looking at that Ukraine situation, as you mentioned, sanctions on Russia, indeed, the EU slapping sanctions against Russia after they annexed Crimea back in 2014. But in Ukraine, again, this week, we saw another escalation of violence. NATO condemned the ceasefire and called on Russia, the breaking of the ceasefire, rather, and asked Russia to use its influence to help stop the fighting in the region. Almost 20,000 people are without electricity as temperatures fall below -15. Russian President Vladimir Putin, for his part, accuses Kiev of inciting the violence, trying to get support from the US and the EU. Clément Bonnereau reports.
Violence continues in eastern Ukraine. Here in the government-held town of Avdiivka, residents say they were woken up by overnight shelling and gunfire.
Something exploded and parts of the roof fell into my bed while I was sleeping. There was a torch on the chair next to me. I took it and saw a huge hole in the ceiling.
Meanwhile, in neighbouring rebel-held Donetsk, residents also reported heavy shelling. Parts of the city were evacuated on Thursday.
I don't know what kinds of weapons were used, but the shelling was terrifying. We've had shelling over the past year, but it was nothing like that.
Eastern Ukraine has been hit by its worst violence in 2 years, with more than 5,000 ceasefire violations in the past week, according to NATO. Under the 2015 so-called Minsk agreements, Ukrainian troops and pro-Russian rebels agreed to a cessation of hostilities. Each side has blamed the other for the latest outbreak. Russia, who denies supporting the rebels, was quick to point the finger at Kiev.
Ukrainian leadership today needs money, and the best way to squeeze out money from the European Union and certain countries of the European Union, as well as the United States and international financial institutions, is to present itself as a victim of aggression.
Ukraine and NATO have called on Russia to put pressure on rebels and prevent further escalation of violence. Meanwhile, the new US ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, condemned Russia's actions in the region.
And indeed, that a new US ambassador to the UN also said that America would keep its sanctions on Russia as long as Crimea was annexed, even though we know Trump would like to improve relations with Russia. But that tool of sanctions, it is pretty much the only one governments have at the minute, so they need to be maintained, do they not?
Well, I'm not sure that the policy of sanctions had ever good results. And we should take the lessons of the current situation. The sanctions have not improved the attitude of Moscow towards the question of Ukraine. So I don't think that's the way we should follow. We should be looking for dialogue on Ukraine, on Syria, on the security in Europe, try to find some common grounds with Russia. But also, we should stick to a very firm position concerning our principles. We should not agree just to forget about Crimea. We should not agree just to forget about what Russia is doing in Ukraine.
So what do we do? Because talking doesn't work.
But we should try to find and take common initiative. For example, we know that there is a way possible with the neutrality of Ukraine and federalism in Ukraine, having elections, and try to put all of our forces to help Ukraine get out of the economic and financial crisis they are facing. So I believe there is a roadmap possible. We should really increase the dialogue within the Minsk agreements.
It hasn't gotten us very far.
But now Russia has an interest because Russia wants a strong dialogue with the US. We should not be the one in the middle losing while they discuss the main issues without us. So we should really be part of the solution of Ukraine. We should really be able to take the lead towards Donald Trump and tell him, okay, that's our red line. That's our key interest concerning Ukraine. And you should take that into account. And concerning Vladimir Putin, saying, okay, we are ready to dialogue. We are ready to have a roadmap to lift the sanctions. But I think that it is an interest.
Do they care what the EU thinks?
Yes, I think that if we play it right, if France and Germany, they go back working together very strongly, and if we put on the table a proposal that is quite interesting for Russia, because Russia, we should not forget, is facing a strong economic crisis, strong financial crisis. People of Russia is suffering. So, okay, this is not the first element for Vladimir Putin, which is the security and the feeling that Russia is back in the international scene. But on the long run, this counts.
So bring Russia more back into the fold, because you mentioned that the idea of a neutrality of Ukraine. Of course, this crisis all broke out when Ukraine tried to move towards the European Union.
I think that was a mistake. I think the geography is important. And like Finland, like many countries in this region, Ukraine has to have strong links with Russia as well as with the EU. We should not play one against the other.
But if
that was a huge
wants
mistake.
To join the EU, they should be allowed.
Yes, but the interest of the EU is not to have an element of tension between us and Russia. So on the long run, things might change. But right now, I think there is the possibility of a strategy to try to tackle what is the most important for Ukraine today, which is the financial and economic crisis, and try both Russia and Europe to help the process of securing the unity of Ukraine. Of course, there is a price, and I think neutrality and federalism is the price to pay for that.
So Ukraine would have to accept that and then see what time will tell. And do you think, is that the moment? Because I know I've read that you said the EU has pushed Russia away, pushed it towards China even, ostracized it. Was it at this point? Was it before? Why? What could the EU do now really to show Putin that it doesn't just mistrust Russia?
I think that we have common interest. For example, discussing the security of Europe is in the interest of Vladimir Putin as well as the interest of Europe. We have not discussed such issues since 1975, the Helsinki Agreement. Things have completely changed. We have the fall of the Wall of Berlin, we have the fall of the Soviet Union, so we are living in a different world. We should go back, discuss this element of security, this policy of security, because there is fears on the Russian side, and there is fear on the European side,
sure.
in Romania, Poland, the Baltic states.
And even more with general elections coming, a lot of countries are saying that
They are
the
fearful
Russians
of
are paying for
immixtion
parties
in their own affairs.
Even the Dutch are going to hand count their election votes, fearing a hack by Russian forces. There's also accusations that they're funding certain far-right anti-EU parties in the EU. How much do you believe that is true? How much is Russia trying to play a hand in
I believe we are living in
politics
a
here?
world where interference can come from everywhere. The Russian might be fearful of US interference concerning cybersecurity. We might be fearful of American interference, Russian interference, Chinese interference. This is the world of today. Cybersecurity is a new component of security. So each one of us has to take that into account. There is not one good guy and one bad guy. There is a more dangerous world. And because the world is more dangerous, that's why we need more cooperation. And if each time we have tension, each time we have a crisis, the only solution for our countries is to send troops and use the military, we will do mistakes and mistakes again.
Okay, it sounds like quite a knotty tangle to try and weave
It's a
through
difficult
there.
moment. Unfortunately for Europe, this is happening in a moment where Europe is in many ways neutralized by the perspective of elections. French elections,
German elections, Dutch elections.
exactly, Czech elections. This is a very bad timetable for Europe. And that's why we have to find a way, even if we are facing elections, to have our countries, our leaders taking initiative and try to find time and energy enough to defend what is the most important for us, which is our security.
Okay, and trust and unity is the way forward, is what I'm hearing. Mr. Dominique de Villepin, thanks so much for your time and talking to us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks also, of course, to you at home for having watched. That brings us to the end of this edition of Talking Europe.